My daughter and I skipped groceries for 2 weeks just so we could afford one gift for the family Christmas exchange. She wrapped it herself, with tape sheets saved from her school supplies, and carried it into my sister's living room like it was made of glass. Her hands were shaking when she set it under the tree. My sister picked it up, turned it over once, and said it out loud to the whole room. "Well, this is what poverty looks like, everyone." Everyone laughed. My mother's laughter echoed above everyone else's. My daughter didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just turned around and walked out of the room without a single word. That night, after I tucked her into bed in the small apartment we could barely afford, I found the first piece of paper that would end up changing everything, and it had nothing to do with a Christmas gift at all. My name is Zora Whitlock, and for 6 years, it had been just me and my daughter, Unia. I want to tell you honestly what our life looked like because I think people who've never lived it imagine poverty as something dramatic, something you can see coming from a mile away. It isn't. It's quiet. It's a coupon folded into a wallet. It's turning the thermostat down 2 degrees and telling your daughter it's cozy sweater weather. It's learning exactly which grocery store marks down bread on Tuesday nights. Unia was 8 years old that Christmas, and she understood more about our budget than most adults understand about their own. She never asked me for things. That was the part that used to break my heart the most. Not that we didn't have money, but that she'd learned, at 8, not to ask. Her father, Grady, had been a good man once. We married young, and, for the first few years, things were fine. He worked construction, I waitressed at a diner off Route 9, and, between the two of us we made it work. Then he fell from scaffolding on a job site and shattered 3 vertebrae in his back. The company's insurance covered the surgery, barely, but not the year of recovery afterward, not the therapy, not the slow crawl back toward being able to stand up straight. Grady didn't handle it well. I don't say that with anger anymore, I say it because it's true. The man who couldn't work anymore became someone who couldn't look at himself in the mirror, and eventually, someone who couldn't look at us either. He left 2 years after the accident. Not dramatically. He just packed a bag one afternoon while Unia was at school and told me he needed space to figure himself out. I haven't seen him since, except for 2 birthday cards that showed up a year late. So it became me and Unia against the world, and mostly, the world just meant rent, groceries, and my double shifts at the diner plus the housekeeping job I picked up on weekends at a motel outside town. Our routine had a rhythm to it that outsiders never saw. I'd wake at 5 to get to the diner by 6, drop Unia at school myself since we couldn't afford the bus fee some months, and pick up my second job at the motel on weekends while a neighbor watched her for a few dollars an hour. Unia packed her own lunches by the time she was 7, partly because she liked doing it but partly, I think, because she understood without being told that it saved me time I didn't have. She was a bright kid. Her 3rd-grade teacher once pulled me aside to say Unia had scored into the gifted program and asked, gently, whether we had access to books at home. We did, not many, but I started taking her to the library every other Friday after that, and it became one of the few things in our week that cost nothing and gave her everything. My family did not make things easier. I come from a family with exactly 2 daughters, me and my younger sister, Georgette. Growing up, Georgette was the golden child in every sense of the word. She was better at school, better at making our mother laugh, better, somehow, at being exactly the kind of daughter my mother, Adeline, wanted. I loved my sister.
I want to be clear about that.
For a long time, I loved her without complication, the way you love someone before you understand the shape of the space you take up in their life. Georgette married well, a man named Preston who ran a chain of boutique fitness studios across 3 counties, and by the time Unia was born, my sister was living in a house with a circular driveway and a housekeeper of her own. My mother moved in with them 2 years after my father passed away, and from that point forward, our family gatherings had a very particular geography. Georgette's house was the sun. Everyone else orbited around it. I was invited to holidays. I want to say that clearly because I know how this can sound. I was never uninvited, never erased. I was included the way you include a chair that doesn't quite match the dining set. Present, useful for the head count, but never quite belonging. My mother had a habit of asking me questions in front of everyone that she never asked me privately. Still at the diner, Zora? Still in that apartment on Delford Street? Always with a small smile, like she was performing concern for an audience. I used to tell myself she meant well. I told myself that for years. The Christmas exchange had been a tradition in our family since before I can remember. Every year, each household drew a name, and every year, my mother made it very clear that presentation mattered as much as the gift itself. She'd comment on wrapping paper. She'd comment on bows. It was, I understand now, one more quiet stage for her to perform on. That year, Unia drew her cousin's name, Georgette, and Preston's youngest, a boy named Holden who already owned more toys than I'd owned in my entire childhood. I watched my daughter agonize over what to get him for almost 2 weeks, flipping through the one toy catalog she still had from her school book fair, circling things in pencil, and then erasing them when she remembered we couldn't afford it. Money was tighter than usual that December. The motel had cut my hours going into the holidays, and my car needed a repair I kept putting off because I couldn't put off rent. I did the math more times than I want to admit, and the answer never changed. If we bought groceries the way we normally did, there would be no gift. If we bought the gift, we'd eat differently for a couple of weeks. More rice, more eggs, less of everything else. I didn't tell Unia we were making that trade. I made the decision myself, quietly, the way you make decisions when you're the only adult in the room. We went to the store together, and she picked out a model airplane kit for Holden, the kind you build yourself with tiny plastic pieces and a little tube of glue. It cost $18. She held it like it was the most important object in the world because to her it was. She wrapped it herself at our kitchen table 2 nights before Christmas, using wrapping paper I'd saved from the year before, carefully turned inside out so the creases from prior folding wouldn't show. She used tape from her school pencil case because we'd run out of the regular kind. She wrote Holden's name on it in her best handwriting, the way she'd been taught in school, with a little heart dotting the I. I remember watching her from the kitchen doorway and feeling something in my chest that was equal parts pride and grief. Pride because she cared so much about giving someone else something nice. Grief because I knew even then how the room was going to receive it. We arrived at Georgette's house on Christmas Eve. The driveway was already lined with cars nicer than anything I'd ever owned. Inside, the tree stood nearly to the ceiling, professionally decorated in gold and white, with gifts stacked beneath it in matching wrapping paper that Georgette ordered from a boutique stationery company every year. Unia carried her gift in with both hands. I watched her hesitate at the edge of the living room, taking in all those matching, glossy packages, before she found a spot near the back of the tree and set hers down as gently as she could, like she was afraid it might not belong there. We opened gifts an hour later, going around the room by age, youngest to oldest. When it was Holden's turn, he tore into Unia's gift eagerly enough. Kids don't see wrapping paper the way adults do, but Georgette reached over before he'd even gotten the box fully open. She turned it over in her hands, taking in the mismatched tape, the slightly crumpled corners, the recycled paper. And then she said it, loud enough for the whole room.
Well,
this is what poverty looks like, everyone. I want you to understand what that room sounded like in the half-second afterward. It wasn't shocked silence. It was laughter, quick, easy, the kind of laughter that tells you a comment landed exactly where it was aimed. My mother laughed the hardest of anyone. She actually wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, still chuckling, and said something about how she always did admire creativity out of necessity. I looked at Unia, my daughter, 8 years old, standing in the middle of a room full of adults laughing at the gift she'd built with her own hands out of $18 and 2 weeks of skipped groceries. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word in her own defense. She just turned around, walked past all of us, and left the room. Nobody stopped her. Nobody but me even seemed to notice she'd gone. I found her 20 minutes later, sitting on the stairs outside the bathroom, knees pulled up to her chest. "You okay, baby?" I asked, sitting down next to her. She didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, her voice was steady in a way that unsettled me more than tears would have. "Why do they think we're funny, Mom?" I didn't have a good answer for her. I still don't, not really. I told her something about how some people mistake cruelty for humor because it makes them feel bigger than they actually are, and she nodded like she understood it better than I did. We left not long after that, making an excuse about her being tired. Nobody argued to keep us there. That night, back in our apartment, I tucked Unia into bed and sat with her until she fell asleep, which took longer than usual. When I finally went to my own room, I couldn't sleep either. I sat at the small desk in the corner of my bedroom, and my eyes landed on an old shoebox pushed into the back corner of my closet, the one with what remained of my father's paperwork. I'd been meaning to sort through it properly for almost 2 years, ever since I'd moved apartments and packed it away, without really looking at what was inside. I kept putting it off. Some part of me, I think, wasn't ready to sit with what little of him was left in a cardboard box. But something about that night, about watching my daughter get laughed at and not being able to do a single thing to stop it, made me finally pull it down and open it. My father had never been rich, but he had never laughed at me either. He'd worked 31 years as a machinist and had a habit, I remembered, of talking about putting something aside for me and Georgette whenever the subject of our futures came up, though he was never specific about what that meant. He'd also sold a small rental property he'd inherited from his own father a few years before he passed, something I only half remembered hearing about at the time, distracted as I was by Grady's accident and everything that came with it. I never once thought to ask what happened to that money afterward. It hadn't occurred to me that there was a afterward to ask about. Buried near the bottom of the box, under old photographs and a stack of expired coupons he'd apparently saved out of habit, I found a folded letter from an attorney's office I didn't recognize. It was dated almost 5 years earlier, a few months before he passed. It referenced something called a residual distribution tied to a trust established in both my and Georgette's names. I had never heard of any trust. Not once, in 4 years since his death, had anyone mentioned it. I sat with that letter for a long time before I finally put it back in the box and went to bed. I told myself it was probably nothing, an old policy that had already been settled, a formality that no longer mattered. But something about the date, and the total silence around it since, sat wrong in my stomach in a way I couldn't quite shake. I didn't do anything about the letter for almost 3 weeks. Between work and Unia's school schedule, I barely had time to think, let alone chase down a 5-year-old mystery. But it kept surfacing in quiet moments, while I was folding laundry, while I was driving home from a double shift, while I was watching Unia do homework at our kitchen table. Eventually, I called my father's old attorney's office, the name printed at the top of that letter. The receptionist told me the original attorney had retired, but a colleague, a woman named Tabitha Reyes, had taken over his remaining files and could speak with me. Tabitha met me on her lunch break at a coffee shop near her office, since I couldn't afford to take time off for a formal consultation. She pulled up what she could find in the firm's records and confirmed what the letter had implied. My father had, in fact, established a trust several years before his death, intended to be split evenly between Georgette and me upon his passing, meant to help fund things like Unia's future education and, frankly, meant to give me some kind of safety net given how things had gone with Grady. According to the firm's last records, that trust had never been formally closed. It had simply gone quiet. Who would have handled the distribution? I asked her. Tabitha checked the file again. Your mother was listed as the trustee, she said. She would have been the one responsible for managing and eventually distributing the funds to both of you. I remember sitting in that coffee shop feeling like the floor had tilted slightly under my chair. My mother had never once mentioned a trust. Not at the funeral, not in the years since, not during a single one of those holidays where she'd asked me, smiling, whether I was still at the diner. Tabitha offered to help me look into it further, off the clock at first, mostly out of what she later admitted was plain disbelief at what she was uncovering. Over the following month, working with a forensic accountant she brought in, a clearer picture started to form. The trust had, in fact, been distributed, just not the way it was supposed to be. Roughly $210,000 had moved out of the trust account over the years since my father's passing, funneled in increments into an account connected to Georgette and Preston's fitness studio business, categorized in the trust's sparse records as administrative distributions and family support disbursements. My mother had signed off on every transfer as trustee. My name did not appear once. Not a single dollar had ever reached me. I sat with that number for a long time. $210,000. Enough to have covered Unia's school clothes without a second thought. Enough to have fixed my car the first time it broke down, not the third. Enough, quite possibly, to have kept Grady and me from unraveling the way we did, if it had come at the right moment. I thought a lot in those weeks about how my mother must have justified it to herself, because she was never a woman who saw herself as dishonest. I don't think she ever thought of it as stealing. I think she'd convinced herself, one transfer at a time, that Georgette needed the money more because Georgette was building something, a business, a bigger house, a life that looked from the outside like it required investment. And I was just surviving. In my mother's mind, survival didn't need funding. It was just something I did, quietly in the background, while Georgette's life was the one worth putting money behind. I don't think she ever once sat down and decided to take from me on purpose. I think she simply decided, over and over, that I didn't count as someone worth giving anything to. And all that time, while I skipped groceries to afford an $18 model airplane kit, my sister had been living inside the very money that should have belonged to both of us equally. Tabitha was careful with me through all of it. She reminded me more than once that having a suspicion and having proof strong enough to act on were two very different things, and that we needed to be thorough before I said a single word to my family. Over the following 2 months, the picture only got more damning. The forensic accountant traced a consistent pattern: funds moving from the trust account into the fitness studio's operating account roughly twice a year, always timed conveniently around tax season and around Georgette's studio expansions. There was a particularly clear trail from the year Georgette and Preston opened their third location, a sum large enough that it couldn't be explained away as coincidence. There was also, buried in the trust's own paperwork, an initial letter my father had apparently sent to my mother years before his death, one Tabitha found in the firm's archived correspondence. In it, he explicitly stated his wish that the trust be split evenly between both my daughters, without exception, and specifically noted his concern that Zora not be left behind due to her circumstances. He had seen it coming. Even before he passed, he'd worried about exactly this. Reading that letter for the first time undid something in me that I'd been holding together for years. I cried in Tabitha's office in a way I hadn't let myself cry in front of anyone since Grady left. Not just because of the money, though the money was staggering. I cried because my father had tried, in his own quiet way, to protect me from this exact outcome, and the people closest to me had ignored his wishes for years without so much as a conversation. Tabitha eventually advised me that we had enough documentation to proceed formally, first with a demand letter to my mother and sister outlining the breach of trust, and if that didn't resolve things appropriately, with a civil claim through probate court. I want to be honest about how frightened I was to send that letter. Some small, tired part of me still hoped my mother would read it and simply apologize, that maybe there had been some innocent misunderstanding I hadn't accounted for. I know now how naive that hope was. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday in early March. By that Thursday, my mother called me for the first time in months. She didn't ask how I was doing or how Unia was doing in school. She asked, in a voice tighter than I'd ever heard from her, why I was trying to tear this family apart over money. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I wasn't the one who'd taken money that belonged to me and spent 7 years pretending it didn't exist. She didn't have an answer for that. She hung up shortly after, and I didn't hear from her again for almost 3 weeks. Georgette's response came through her own attorney instead of directly to me, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking it. Her attorney's letter offered a partial settlement, a fraction of the actual amount, framed as a gesture of goodwill to preserve family relationships. Tabitha and I both agreed it wasn't close to acceptable, and we proceeded with filing the civil claim in probate court that same month. Word apparently spread through the rest of the family faster than I expected. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, reached out to me directly, something she'd never done before, to say she'd long suspected something was off about how the trust had been handled, but had never had proof or standing to say anything. She became, unexpectedly, one of the few relatives who spoke to me with something other than judgment through the entire process. Other relatives were less kind about it. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent me a message suggesting I was airing dirty laundry, by involving lawyers instead of handling it as a family. Handling it as a family was exactly what had gotten Unia and me here in the first place, and I didn't respond to that message, or the two others that echoed it in the weeks that followed. In the middle of all this, Grady resurfaced, calling out of nowhere to ask if Unia was okay, since he'd heard through a mutual friend that I was going through something. It was our first real conversation in over 3 years. When I told him what had actually happened, he went quiet for a long moment and said he was sorry, plainly, without excuses. I let him start calling Unia every couple of weeks after that, not because I'd forgotten how things ended, but because she deserved the chance to decide, as she got older, what kind of relationship she wanted with her father. I kept my own expectations low and my boundaries clear, and the arrangement has held steadier than I expected. The case moved slowly, the way these things tend to. Probate court is not fast, and Georgette's attorney fought every step, requesting delays, disputing the accounting figures, arguing that some of the distributions had technically been loans rather than gifts, despite no loan documentation existing anywhere in the trust's records. It took the better part of a year. During that time, Georgette's fitness studio business, which had always looked far more successful from the outside than it apparently was on paper, began showing cracks. The forensic accounting used in my case became part of the public court record, and word travels fast in a small business community. 2 of her studio locations quietly closed within 8 months of the case becoming public. Preston, I later learned, moved out of their house not long after that. Whether over the money or simply the mounting pressure, I never found out for certain, and honestly, I stopped caring too. I sat through 2 hearings in person before the final ruling came down. The first was little more than procedural, both sides presenting their initial arguments while the judge set a schedule for discovery. The second, months later, was harder. Georgette testified for almost 40 minutes. At first, she stuck to the same language her attorney had used in the settlement letter: informal family support, distributions with implied consent, phrases clearly built to make 7 years of quiet transfers sound like something warm and mutual instead of what they were. But under cross-examination, when Tabitha pressed her on why none of it had ever been disclosed to me directly, something in her composure slipped. She said, almost sharply, that she'd always assumed I wouldn't have known what to do with that kind of money anyway. She said I'd always been the one who struggled, implying, without quite saying it outright, that struggling was a permanent condition rather than a circumstance, something closer to a personality trait than a set of bad breaks. She suggested at one point that if I'd truly needed the money, I should have asked for it directly instead of waiting to find out about it years later, as if the entire structure of a trust wasn't built specifically so that I wouldn't have to ask anyone for anything at all. I remember sitting very still while she said all of that, watching my sister explain, under oath, why the years I'd spent skipping groceries had simply never occurred to her as something she was contributing to. It was the closest thing to an honest answer I ever got from her, and it told me everything I needed to know about how she'd been able to look at me across a Christmas table and hold up my daughter's gift the way she had. My mother, when it was her turn, spent most of her testimony insisting she had always intended to make things right eventually, a phrase the judge asked her to clarify twice, since nothing in the trust's records showed any plan to do so. I testified as well. I hadn't expected how strange it would feel to sit in a wood-paneled courtroom and describe, out loud, in detail, exactly what our life had looked like while that money sat in accounts I never knew existed. The grocery skipping, the coupon folding, the thermostat turned down 2 degrees. Tabitha had warned me the specifics would matter to the judge, that concrete detail carries more weight in these cases than general complaints of unfairness, and she was right. I watched the judge's expression shift, almost imperceptibly, somewhere around the part where I described Unia wrapping her own gift with tape from her pencil case. Unia, for her part, had questions of her own throughout that year, the kind I answered honestly without burdening an 8-year-old with more than she needed to carry. I told her, in pieces appropriate to her age, that some grown-ups had made choices that weren't fair to us, and that we were working to make it right, and that none of it was because of anything she had done. She absorbed it quietly, occasionally surprising me months later with a question that told me she'd been turning it over in her mind the whole time. There was one afternoon close to the end of the process when she asked me if I thought her grandmother and aunt were sorry. I told her honestly that I didn't know, and that it mattered less than she might think, because being sorry doesn't undo what someone chose to do while they thought no one was looking. She nodded slowly at that, the way she nods when something settles into place for her permanently. The judge's ruling came almost 14 months after I'd first opened that shoebox at my kitchen desk. The court found clear evidence of a breach of fiduciary duty on my mother's part as trustee and ordered full restitution of my share of the trust, plus interest calculated from the date each improper distribution had occurred. It came to just over $240,000 once interest was factored in. The court also removed her as trustee of the family trust and referred her conduct to the Probate Oversight Office for further review, given the clear documentation of repeated, deliberate misdirection of funds over multiple years. Georgette was held jointly responsible for a portion of the restitution, given that the funds had gone directly into accounts she controlled. Her attorney negotiated a payment structure rather than a lump sum, but the obligation was legally binding, and the court retained oversight to ensure it was honored. A few months after the ruling, Tabitha let me know the State Probate Oversight Office had completed its own review of my mother's conduct as trustee. She was formally barred from ever serving as a fiduciary or trustee on any future family or estate matter, a detail that felt smaller on paper than it did in practice. To my mother, who had spent her whole life curating the appearance of being the responsible, capable one, it was its own kind of quiet, lasting consequence, one no apology could undo. I didn't feel triumphant when I got the call from Tabitha telling me the ruling had come through. I felt mostly exhausted, the particular exhaustion that comes after carrying something heavy for so long you forget what it feels like to set it down. I used a portion of the restitution to move Unia and me into a small house of our own. Nothing extravagant, just 3 bedrooms and a yard big enough for the dog she'd been asking for since she was 5. I set aside a significant portion for her education, exactly the way my father had intended all along. I finally got my car properly repaired instead of patched together one more time. I did not go back to my mother's house for another holiday gathering. I did not accept Georgette's one attempt at a phone call, made almost a year after the ruling, in which she reportedly wanted to move past all of this. Some bridges, once you understand fully what they were built on, aren't worth walking back across. The next December, Unia and I spent Christmas Eve in our own living room, in our own house, with a tree we'd decorated together using ornaments she'd made in art class. There was no competition over wrapping paper. There was no audience to perform for.